Good morning and welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar for June. We've got a great session lined up today. My name's Ben Shepherd. I'm here with my co-founder and partner in crime, Hannah Norberg. Before we get started with the session, Hannah's going to introduce the session and our speakers. Let me tell you a few things about the Trade Policy Research Forum if this is the first time you're joining us. So we've been going since 2020. We're nearly 5 years old. And as you can tell from our logo, which looks suspiciously like the Sydney Harbour Bridge in honor of my accent, um, we are about building bridges. So one thing that we try to do, and I think hopefully we're going to do it really well today, is to build a bridge between research and policy because there's so much work going on in trade research. It's been really a fantastic period to be absorbing some of the cutting edge research that's going on out there. But the question always is, how do we turn it into better policy? How do we take this and actually influence the decisions that people are making when it comes to trade policy around the world? So that's one bridge that we're trying to build. Another bridge that we're trying to build is between the different parts of the trade policy profession. We know that trade policy isn't just about economists. It also involves lawyers, public policy professionals, managers, and all sorts of professionals who are engaged in the work of making trade policy better, and of course, dealing with all of the things that are going on in the trade policy world at a given time. So we try to bring together people from different skill sets and to get them to talk to each other over research and policy. Then we're also trying to build a bridge between some of the centers of trade policy. If we think of global centers, for better or worse, Washington, D.C., Brussels, all these sorts of places, Geneva, are where trade policy negotiations often happen. But there's tremendous energy out there, particularly in low and middle income countries, to learn more about trade policy and to do better trade policy and to use it to promote long-term growth and development. And so that's a bridge that we're trying to build to by bringing some of the best research and policy that is going on in the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world to people everywhere, particularly in low and middle income countries. So that's what we're set up to do. You'll see that we've got a great session today. As we go through the session, please feel free to intervene. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. You'll see that the chat box is open, so please put all of your questions and comments in there. You can also use the Zoom Q&A feature to post your questions and comments. We like to stay in touch with everyone. You'll see a screen that pops up at the end of the webinar, which is our sign up list for the mailing list. So please do keep in touch with us that way. We have a LinkedIn group of about 5,000 people, so please do join us on LinkedIn. It's a great place to post a paper, get some comments, talk about a new policy brief or something that you've got going on. And we really do hope that this is going to be a great and very active session. So with that, let me hand over to Hannah to introduce the session and our speakers.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Ben. Before we do, I'm just going to just throw in a little thing about the public forum coming up. So the WTO Public Forum is coming up on September 17th and 18th in Geneva. And we have a very new feature there. So on September 17th, we have a whole day of trade policy. It's called Trade Policy Hub, is what it's called. And which means that Ben and I and Mauricio Sanade, who used to run the European Trade Study Group, have a whole day on trade policy discussions. So if you go to the WTO Public Forum website, you'll find our call for proposals. And the deadline has been moved up, so you have until next Friday to put in your proposal, and we hope to see you there. And we hope that that will be a huge success so that we can convince Javier to let us do it again next year. So please make sure that you have that. This webinar is particularly exciting. We have been waiting. Good things come to those who wait. And here we have very busy people, so we had to wait 6 months to get to fit into Pol's very busy schedule. So Pol Antras, he needs no introduction. I've seen him mentioned on social media for this webinar as a superstar. And of course he is. So Professor of Economics at Harvard, who will be talking about his new paper, The Uncharted Waters of International Trade, to point us to where we are and what where research should be going. So it dovetails very well, I think, Ben, as we're turning 5 with the first session that we had with Bernard Hoekman on pretty much a similar topic. So we're really excited about that. And then for policy, we have Sebastien Dessus from who's the practice manager for global trade and regional integration at the World Bank. And so really important to remember. So for this particular webinar, this always happens, but we have hundreds and hundreds of people signed up for today. So what's always true and what's even more true today is that we will run out of time. We always, 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 always do. And these are busy people, so we have to let them go at the exact moment that the clock strikes 4 or 10, depending on where you are, or whatever the time is, wherever you are, but in the next full hour. And so make sure that you start putting your questions and comments in the chat box or in the Q&A as we go. If you don't put them in and you don't do it on time, we can't help you. So make sure that you do that. And start us off by putting in the chat box where you're coming in from, because that's always really interesting to see. And any interest that you have. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to you, Paul.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks so much, Ben. And good morning. Oh, I need to share the slides. Sorry about that. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Let me do this and then share. Are we good? Excellent. So I'm really delighted to be here. As Hannah was saying, time is scarce. So what I was planning on doing is, or what I was asked to do is to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have Sebastian's discussion, and then hopefully ample time for Q&A. And what I'll speak about broadly is this sort of linking the academics and the policy making, but I'm going to do that in a focused manner by giving you a taste of a recent paper that I wrote, which was related to lecture that I gave at the American Academic Association meetings in January of last year, and then at the BBA Foundation in Madrid in December. Let me give you the background, and I'll tell you a bit more about the motivation. But the background is, that's a little bit maybe it's not particularly modest, but I do think that our academia, and in particular the field of international trade, has actually made a lot of progress in the last 25, 30 years. So this has been really a transformative set of developments in the last few years. I also think that the timing is fortuitous in the sense that we find ourselves more policymakers than academics, perhaps, but in real a bad need for expertise, in that a lot of the shocks that are hitting the world economy now are actually trade policy shocks. At the same time, I would argue, somewhat perhaps controversially within academia, probably less so among policymakers, but I would argue that our ability to delineate scenarios and guide policy is still hampered by the lack of analysis in some areas. That is, we have some views, we have some answers. It's not entirely clear that we have the answers that policymakers need today. In other words, at least for academics, there are many so-called uncharted waters in international trade research. There's many treasures to uncover. So what I do in the article is basically walk through, and I'll be very brief today about this, the so-called charter waters. What justifies the first bullet point here, this transformative developments? Why can I claim, or I feel comfortable claiming that these developments have been transformative? And then I'll focus on the more interesting parts, which are the uncharted waters. Where do I see work needed? Where do I hope we'll see more work? Some of it is theoretical. I'll be quick here because that's maybe not going to be the main interest for the session today. I will talk a little bit about empirical waters because this is not so much about complicated empirical work. A lot of it is about data collection and data sources. And then finally, I'll have a few words on policy, uncharted waters, but probably that's something we can keep discussing in the Q&A. Okay. Before I get started, 3 caveats. For those that are in academia here and listening to me, maybe some of you that may be more seasoned, you will find myself discussing research on some topics and referring it as uncharted waters. And I'm surely going to offend you, okay? Because some of what I call uncharted waters, of course, they were charted. There's very good work in some of these areas. I would argue that there might be a benefit in revisiting some areas. Perhaps we have now better, more modern vessels, so we might be able to better find some treasures with this new machinery. Also, for academics and young academics in particular, selection bias. Always have keep that in mind. You know, there are waters that haven't been charted for a reason. Okay, they might be treacherous. Okay, so I do think that what I will outline are things that are doable. Okay, but they're not going to be easy. Low-hanging fruit is probably most of it has been collected. And finally, more importantly here, most of what I say in the article is probably more relevant to academics, young academics, but there are aspects that are a bit more related, perhaps helpful for policymakers, and that's something that I'll try to flag today relative to the more academic stuff. Okay? So let me dive in. What are the chartered waters? In the article, I spent a good half of the article on this. That was not my intention. The last thing I wanted to do is write another review article on what's happening in the field. There's many of them. So I just wanted to kind of discuss the uncharted waters. And then I went to my mentor at Harvard, Elhanan Heltman, and he made me see that it was foolish to me just for write a paper saying everything that we haven't done, that this would make us look like fools. So you have to tell them what we've done. Otherwise, you know? Okay, so that's what I did. You start doing that, half of the paper is that. But you know, if you haven't been keeping up with some of the stuff, if you really want a crash course on this, you know, I mean, I'd encourage you to take a look because I've tried to kind of distill what I think are the main developments in just a few pages. What do I talk about? I talk about four main areas. One is the firm level approach to trade, work on multinational firms and global value chains, the explosion of quantitative trade theory, and what I call empirical work unshackled. What do I mean by that? Very quickly, firm level approach. This is basically building on the empirical work of Andy Bernard and collaborators, building on the theoretical work of Mark Mellitz and others and collaborators. I think many people in the trade field these days conceptualize trade differently than how people did it 30 years ago. For sure, but many people have learned to interpret customs data through the lens of models where those customs forms are basically reflecting decisions of firms that have decided to either sell goods at long distances relative to just to local customers, or that they've decided to import goods from foreign suppliers. So this idea that thinking about the firm level decision, and then yes, we might have things to say about macro GDP, but only after aggregating these firm level decisions. We've learned empirically there's from Andy Bernard and collaborators, there's a lot of facts that motivate that analysis. We know there's massive concentration in trade flows. I'm showing this for the US here, where you see the top 1% of importers, exporters accounts for close to 80% of US trade. So just understanding a few hundred firms is going to give you a good picture of exports and imports. And then also the idea that firms are heterogeneous in certain ways. They react differently to trade liberalization. Trade liberalization weeds out relatively inefficient firms, allows superstar firms to expand. There's a bunch of nice empirical work documenting this, and then the beautiful and seminal paper by my colleague Mark Mellitz that showed how a very simple extension of the Krugman 1980 paper was sufficient to explain this fact, just adding intra-industry heterogeneity in a standard-looking Krugman model. And that spanned a massive literature analyzing variants of it, extensions, and so on. Somewhat in parallel, the literature on multinational firms, which is obviously very old, I mean, it sort of goes back to the 1950s and 60s, and there's a lot of very good work in the 70s and 80s, Jim Markuson being obviously a key contributor there. It's also that literature has taken off. I think I would emphasize two aspects of it. First, the firm dimension, right? So models of multinational firms were always models of firms, obviously, but they didn't embrace this idea of heterogeneity. Why are multinationals, some firms are multinationals, others are not. What sort of makes some firms make those decisions. And then more importantly, we've moved away from simple models of horizontal versus vertical FDI, market seeking versus cost reducing FDI. And we're now talking about models where production processes are much more complex. Think about semiconductors, multiple stages of production done in many countries. So that's been work that is pushing for an interpretation of customs forms that is not just a firm transaction, a firm-to-firm transaction, but realizing that the transaction in a customs form is very often a small part of a much larger chain, which from a theoretical point of view raises a lot of interesting and complex issues. Granularity in trade flows, granularity in multinational activity, recent work of mine with US data showing that even though multinationals are a very small percentage of US firms or US firms that do manufacturing, they account for between 80 and 90% of world trade. So again, suggestive of the fact that if you were to be interested in US exports and imports, maybe it's a bit restrictive to think about those transactions as being independent of what these firms are doing in other countries, because what we're observing in US customs forms are just one segment of their worldwide operations. So maybe you want to think about those interactions and think about how, for instance, trade policy shocks very far in the world might have some implications for US imports and exports. Quantitative trade theory, I'm not going to talk a lot about that. Happy to go over more of that on the Q&A. This has really exploded in academia. It has some spillovers on policy because we see more and more folks coming up with numbers. What are the implications of the US-China trade war in terms of GDP for this country or that country? It's a literature that builds on computer-world general equilibrium models. It's somewhat distinct in that building on the seminal work of Eaton and Cordum, it's tried to kind of make these exercises a little bit more transparent, like reducing welfare effects or real income effects to a few sufficient statistics, a few elasticities that then researchers are going to try to estimate in a credible manner, not just coming up with numbers out of thin air. Great agenda. I don't think it's ready for prime time. Okay. Why is it not ready for prime time? In part because it doesn't really fully embrace the complexities of global value chains, in part because often the market structure that is built into those models is not satisfactory. Just to give you a sense of why I think it is of limited use, Ahmad Lashkarikpour, who's a great trade economist at Purdue, I think, or Indiana, I always get those mixed up, sorry, came up with like the cost in a nice JIE paper, the cost of a global trade war a few years ago. And he's been on social media, Twitter, advertising his work. And so he's saying, if you want to know the answer, here are the numbers. And then I look at the table and I find numbers that just puzzle me. Why is Taiwan actually benefiting from a global trade war? This does not make sense to me. I can make sense of it theoretically in a model that he's writing, in which maybe Taiwan has a huge market share in some sectors that are semiconductors. Therefore, you would imply that it has a lot of market power, maybe can exploit terms of trade and have very high tariff, and therefore a trade war is good for them. But that's not the world I live in. The world I live in is one in which if Taiwan has large market power, it has to do with this. Okay, and it has to do with something that is not like natural resources. If Taiwan started to put very large tariffs or there was a global trade war, it's very likely this industry would massively reorganize. And let alone the fact that if these numbers are coming from Taiwan setting a 60% tariff on the US, well, I don't know if that's a very helpful counterfactual, because that's never going to happen. Okay, that Taiwan is not in a position to start putting high tariffs on the US given the threat of, leave it at that. So that's that. And then the last part I'll skip because I do want to get onto the uncharted waters is this aspects of empirical work, which the trade field was very much dominated by theorists in the past, and empirical work was very nice, but it was very often just trying to test models or follow the structure of models to interpret the data. There's been a flurry of new work, which is just looking at new data sources, new correlations, trying to find plausibly exogenous sources of variation to tease out the impact of some variables on trade, of trade on some variables. So this work has unshackled itself from theoretical constraints, and in some cases delivered really fascinating stuff, and I overviewed it in the paper. Okay, Now, let me talk about what I was supposed to talk about, which is the uncharted waters. I talk a lot about few things in the paper. Some are theoretical. For instance, I spent a bit of time on the need to move away from competitive or monopolistically competitive frameworks and really embrace the notion of oligopoly. It's very easy to motivate it empirically. I showed you the concentration of exports and imports. If you look at the industry level, there's many industries that are dominated by just a handful of producers. Even when you look at the exporting country level, very few exporters in a given sector. So there is a nascent industry, a nascent work on oligopoly, but it's very much focused on just a subset of important issues. Issues of pricing, market power, markups, very important. But as I point out in the paper, there's a lot of other strategic interactions. I think firms, when they decide to enter markets, very often those entry decisions are themselves strategic. Maybe I go before my competitor, or I start importing to cut costs so that I can take market share away from my competitors. Very intuitive things that business people have in mind that I don't think our models are properly capturing. And I argue in the paper and I illustrate that this could actually have important potential for shaping the welfare implications of trade. I spent a big chunk of it on national security. I'll get to that in a second, which is something that I think the trade field had largely ignored. We cannot ignore it anymore, and we have a base. There's some work we can build on. I talk about behavioral economics. I got a lot of heat about this. It seems like some of my colleagues were not very happy that I was suggesting incorporating behavioral economics in trade. True, we're a supply side field. Firms trade is dominated by very large companies that are not going to be making stupid mistakes and like leaving a lot of money on the sidewalk. Having said this, I do, having worked with these models, the type of decisions they face are super complex. It's impossible to imagine that they would be actually not making mistakes or that they have full information to make those decisions. More importantly, behavioral economics is key for understanding why is there so much discontent about globalization. Okay, I think most people in academia, probably in the policymaking world, are convinced that globalization is a force for good. Yet, when we try to explain that to people, they don't seem convinced. Okay, and in part is because not everybody gains, and we've been pointing out that out for a long time, but also because the losses tend to feature much more prominently in people's minds than the gains. And understanding exactly why that's the case, this is something that trade economists need to embrace. And for that, I'm afraid you need behavioral economics. Talk about redistribution more broadly, optimal mechanisms of compensation. I talk a little bit about that economy. I think you guys had a session on digital trade recently, so I certainly don't have as much as expertise as some of the folks that might have spoken about this. But I do invite people to kind of spend more time theorizing and looking at data for this. And then other topics like trade and culture. On national security, let me dive in a little bit. And I'm going to dive in by doing the following, which is simply posing a set of questions that I think we don't have, we still don't have answers, and we actually need answers. So we understand, if you think about trade policy, how academics thought about trade policy, we have a lot of theories of trade policy. If governments are social welfare maximizing, there are instances in which a country might have a unilateral incentive to set tariffs because it can affect world prices in a way that leads to a net gain. We understand that with retaliation, that's less obviously the case, but in principle, there's a first best argument for tariffs. Then we know that with political economy forces, if you think about welfare functions that are not just social welfare, but might put a higher weight on some industries than others, you can still have theories of tariffs in which maybe some sectors are organized, they lobby for protection, they get higher tariffs. So from a point of view of a politically motivated social welfare function, tariffs are optimal. What we are lacking is sort of a frameworks in which we might think about a planner or a government that is trying to maximize welfare in an economic sense, like real income, but also put some weight on this notion of national security. How do we model this? What does it mean? Is there like we consider that with some probability we might enter conflict, and then when we enter conflict, that's going to change the rules of the game. We might need to have arms, weapons. We might need to have production of some goods that we might not be able to import at that point. We understand the implications, I think, of conflict, of like needing to do things, but how do we incorporate it in a formal manner, in a framework? That's something that I think we need to spend more time on. in particular is this notion of the social marginal rate of substitution between real income and national security. It's a bit puzzling to me that we spend most of the late 20th century and earlier 21st century praising globalization, working to reduce tariffs because we understood that that was a force for increasing real income. And now when I go to Washington and I talk to policymakers, they seem quite comfortable going for policies that are going to enhance national security, reduce real income. And if you tell them that you might lose 10% of real income, they would be fine with that. National security is now paramount. Why is this weird state contingent stuff that something doesn't matter and all of a sudden it's like the most important thing? From a theoretical point of view, I'm really kind of curious about making sense of this. How do we think about trade policy, not just in the face of in the threat of conflict, but also in a world in which there are international political alliances? How do these alliances shape optimal trade policy? And in particular, how are these alliances, sorry, shaped by international policies and by specialization? 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I went around, there was all these people writing papers, quantitative trade papers on Chinese decoupling. What would be the implications of China going alone? And I kept saying to people, well, that's an interesting counterfactual. I'm not sure it's the relevant one, because if I go around the world and I talk to people in Chile or I talk to people in other countries, they're not ready to give up trade with China. They cannot. China is their main trading partner. So the US might view some countries as natural allies, but that is not orthogonal to trade policy, to trade flows. Now, all that didn't age well, right? Because I was under the impression that the US, if anything, was going to try to decouple China and like form a coalition. What we've seen since then is a nuclear war where the US seems to just want to decouple. So maybe it's not Chinese decoupling. We should be analyzing US decoupling. That seems like a more reasonable scenario for the future. Now, what I'm arguing here is that perhaps we should be reading, I've been doing that for years, reading a bit more what our friends in political science have been doing. There's a whole field in political science on international relations. Very mature, a lot of work since the mid 20th century. Very often the style is different than in economics, although there's a branch of it that is quite formal and like using game theory and so on. Empirical work, there's a lot of nice recent empirical work. I'm really encouraging people to kind of dive in and see what's done there. Okay. On the empirical waters front, again, I'm gonna, rather than go over everything I do in the paper, I'm largely gonna put a set of questions that I think people have tried to answer and they've answered, but I think the answers are probably not accurate. And then I go over a series of things about how to better collect statistics. I'll focus just on one slide on this. So what are the questions that I posit in the paper that are, I don't think we have definitive answers? What is the causal impact of large-scale export promotion or industrial policies on trade and welfare? I was giving a talk yesterday. It was the chief of the export promotion agency in Spain, and he admitted, I mean, obviously they try to assess how things work, but those analyses are marred with selection biases and all sorts of problems. There's folks like David Atkin and Amit Khandelwal and co-authors that have beautiful randomized controlled trials, but they're very narrow in the setting, right? Like carpet producers in Egypt. There's a lot of good researchers like Christian Volpe, others doing very nice work, but I think there's much more work to be done collaborating governments and academics to better kind of delineate this causal impact of exporting, importing, and productivity and other aspects. Global value chains, world input-output tables, a lot of entrepreneurial efforts to try to construct what I showed you with semiconductors for other industries in a reliable manner. We're still not there. Okay, we are still, all this data is very impressive, the effort that went behind it, but it's a little bit, you need to treat it with a grain of salt. I mean, I describe world input output tables to my students as a sausage, in the sense that it looks good, it tastes good, but you don't want to know how they made it. Okay, so that tells you something. Innovation, okay, the interplay between physical production and innovation. I think a lot of the policies in the US these days are motivated by this idea that by giving up production, eventually we would be giving up innovation. it's a bit schizophrenic to have this view that, oh, we're losing jobs, we're going to lose innovation, and at the same time restricting the inflow of highly skilled individuals from less developed economies. I don't understand how these two things square up with each other, but clearly there's a concern about the offshoring leading to less innovation. Is that a fact? There's some work on this, but I think a lot of more work needs to be focused on this. Obviously, environmental issues, carbon footprint. It's really hard in a world of global value chains. How do you really kind of take a consumption good like an iPad? Okay, what is the carbon footprint of that? I mean, the second question here, the GVC aspect, will help answer this question. Trade and services. Okay, we need to collect better data on that. That's only going to be growing. Digital trade, all this stuff. We need to find ways to better measure this at a more granular, detailed manner. I talk about various aspects of official statistics. One thing that what I push, which is I know it's a little bit silly or too optimistic, which is this idea of more cross country collaboration, sharing data, combining customs forms from various countries so that we can better trace these global value chains. It's very hard to just get a flavor with just data from one country. Global institutions like the WTO, IMF, World Bank could play a bigger role, but in the current geopolitical environment, I know this is wishful thinking. Okay, but on the other hand, national security concerns have made governments really want to know this. So maybe that will be a force for good, a silver lining in this situation. In the meantime, there's private vendors that are trying to construct this data. I was talking to folks at Altana, which is based in New York, I think, which have a very nice business model where firms basically that want to get information on what their competitors might be doing, they can go to them. And there's this arrangement where if you share your data, we're going to allow you to access the other data in a secure manner, like blockchain, all this stuff. So the incentive, it looks very nice. The incentives underlying the model seemed like it could actually grow, and they argue that it's been growing very fast. So maybe that's an alternative way, folks in the private sector with a little bit of skin in the game, trying to kind of build something more useful. The last bit is on policy matters. I'll be the first one to say that theory work, empirical work, always works with a lag. We observe the world, we see things that we didn't anticipate, and then we start thinking about it. And by the time we've made some sense of it, we're on to the next crisis. Okay, so that's the perennial frustration of policymakers, that I don't have answers to what I want, but it's really hard for us to anticipate what's happening. So what I argue in the paper, from the point of view of academics, is everything that I point out we're lacking on theory and empirics. Let's start thinking about the policy aspects of it. Let's not wait 5 years. Let's just get started on that. And then I pose a set of questions that we need to grapple with. Some are things that already came up. Should countries manage GVC participation in the face of geopolitical risk, national security? I talk a little bit about market power with oligopoly. How do we rein on the market power of the superstar firms? What are the optimal policies? How do we design optimal trade adjustment assistance? Should we actually have it? Should we have something beyond unemployment insurance? Should we have active labor market policies in more countries? Environmental policy. And then the last bit, and that's what I'll end with, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit over, is on AI. Okay, I end the paper with a broad thought on AI, which is, will AI completely transform the world of policymaking? And that's building on some ideas that I see people mention, that, with AI, big data, policymakers will have more real-time, better information. So maybe that's going to allow them to move away from this idea that industrial policy is heavy hand of the government and leads to unintended consequences. Because if we do something and we see it's not working, we're going to be able to reverse course very quickly. Okay, so there's this idea that with big data and computational power, we might have a more surgical approach to policy. To put it in one quote from Jack Ma, we may be able to find the invisible hand of the market with big data, and we might finally achieve a planned economy. Okay, that's big words. So are we actually moving away from free markets and to something where the government can actually dictate things much better? I'm less optimistic. And I'm less optimistic for the following reason, because this market socialism, which is not new, is something that Oscar Lange and other people were pushing in the 1930s. It's not necessarily going to be more feasible with AI. If you go back to that debate between Lange and Hayek, which I think Hayek eventually won, this was not about computing power. This is not the reason why the planning problem doesn't work. Even with infinitely powerful computers, the main point is that the market mechanism has these prices that summarize all the information, that provide incentives for people. And that is not something in a world in which incentives matters that a planner can actually achieve. So I don't think that's going to work. Other folks claim, yeah, but what about this idea that I can put policies and test them quickly with big data and I can get at causality? Well, yes, maybe it can help, but I don't think that I'm not an econometrician, but I don't think big data gives you identification always. Okay. So obviously AI will affect the job of policymakers. They should keep an eye on it, use it. I don't think it's going to necessarily lead to bigger governments. So I'm out of time. I'll just leave it with a quote, mostly for academics. If you're a young academic, a PhD student, you read trade papers, you think everything has been done. Okay, why am I going to get in this field if this guy is telling me that there's all this transformation, everything's been done? In the paper, I try to convince you not, and I end with this quote of an economist that wrote a paper, a book in this case, where he outlined a trade model and claimed he had effectively a complete theory of international trade. That's a bold statement. That was Pareto 125 years ago. Okay, so rest assured, there's a lot of hidden treasures to uncover. Again, I'll stop here. Thank you.
That's a great place to end it. Thank you for that presentation. And you're very generous in sharing all of the ideas and the open questions with us. So we really appreciate that. I know we're going to have tons to talk about, but let me maybe hand over to Sebastien first for his discussion comments.
Okay, well, good day. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, thanks very much, Ben and Hannah, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also very humbled to discuss the work of a superstar. I really enjoyed this paper as much the part on Uncharted waters than the new part. After reading those papers, you feel I felt more intelligent. So thank you for providing me this feeling, if it's just even if it's just a feeling. My remarks are organized around a few pillars, but they are being built based on where I sit and what I do daily, which is not research for research or looking at trade for trade, but trying to advise governments and equip them with systems and capacity and infrastructure to leverage trade for economic and social development, which means income, consumption, other form of welfare at the individual level, but also addressing some of the global public goods or global public bads that can be impacted by trade. So I'll discuss a bit the part on the chartered waters and where I think there are some seas that needs to be navigated a bit more frequently, and the new areas of research, and maybe I'll finish with a few words if I have time on what we are doing and how we are trying to contribute to this agenda, and also inviting others to work with us on this thing. I must say overall that I very much agree with most of what Paula said. So it's just putting a different lens on a few aspects of this paper and great presentation today. The first thing I would say is that when looking back at the great achievement of the last 20 or 30 years in research, yes, firm level data, better understanding of a number of things, the role of M&Es, etc. At the same time, it is striking to see that this period corresponds to a period where, at the same time, international trade has grown tremendously, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, and has changed structurally. But it is also the period where we've seen the rising sentiments against trade, against globalization, the rise in populist movement, the rise in protectionist policies, the rise in policy fragmentation. I will come back to that later on, whereby countries are relying less and less on international coordination mechanisms for policy making. So this may be due. So maybe this disconnect between progress in research and with a view to influence policy making and what is happening on the ground may be due first to the fact that, as Paul said in his remarks, that it takes time for research to land into policy making. First, because research not necessarily look at policy upfront, and second, because it takes a lot of time for policymakers to absorb research development. I think at least a decade. It takes at least a decade, in my opinion, for new research to really land into effective policy making, and that's something I think that needs to be considered by researchers. There are also a number of other things that have made probably policy making a bit more complicated in the last decades. One of them is the emergence of non-state actors, such as the MNEs, or actors, state actors, which have remained very, very present in trade activity, sometimes biasing selection into exporting through new forms, new participation in SOEs, new ways of re-influencing trade activities, and that also is complicating, I think, the way we look at policy making. There is also the fact that trade policy has become an instrument to address non-trade objectives, climate, resilience, security, and which is probably more difficult for economists to measure the welfare impact than it is to measure the welfare of the consumption of goods or of change in real incomes. And so that's something also maybe that relates to what Paul has said. But it is true too, I think, that after having said all this, I think that the economist profession has not been sufficiently able to convince policymakers at large of the benefits of trade for development. We have examples, of course, of empirical examples of trade playing a very important role for welfare improvement. But I think, in my opinion, we're still lacking a lot of empirical evidence to convince the skeptics, we see most of the economists are dogmatic, that trade can be sometimes, not always, not everywhere, not for everything, an instrument of social and economic development. So my first call is to say that there's a lot of techniques, there's a lot of research that have been developed in the 25 years that can be just broadened, expanded, so you navigate the same seas, but a lot of work needs to be done further on developing countries. We are struggling at the World Bank to measure the impact of traditional trade reforms using traditional channels of theory of change on jobs, on consumption, and other aspects of welfare. So maybe it's not necessarily fully a new agenda, but an agenda for which there is still a big demand to better understand the impact of trade on development using traditional research framework or analytical framework. So now, when it comes to the uncharted waters that may deserve maybe greater exploration, I'll say a few things. First, security, which is something that Paul has mentioned and which I very much agree with. It's very clear that trade is seen as an instrument of defense, an instrument to address security needs through technological transfer or blocking technological transfer. At the same time, I don't think we are yet at the stage, because it's also something developed in the paper, where we can say that those growing concerns have led to the formation of stable geopolitical blocks, which basically would mean that you don't need to reflect on your trade policy within maybe a smaller geographical context, but it does not really differentiate the way you look at trade policy. I think what is happening in reality is that there's a policy fragmentation, which is a context where it's very difficult to understand with whom to align. Most countries don't want to choose with whom to align, and alliances may change every day. Think about Mexico and Canada. They should be considered as part of the geopolitical bloc around the US, but we see a lot of trade tension, and that creates a lot of problem for countries and a lot of interesting policy questions for countries to address in the current situation, such as what is, for instance, the agreements I should sign in the absence of a functioning WTO, or in the absence of stable geopolitical bloc, to provide the necessary credibility for investors to invest in my countries and participate in value chains out of my country. Maybe these are deep trade agreements can play a better role in some sense to provide this credibility mechanism that did not exist, and we need to think of new ways. We need to identify new ways to identify these credibility anchors. Second is to need to reflect on how to equip firms with the agility they will need to serve different markets, both imports and exports, because maybe their access to these markets will be less secure than before. And so they need to be more agile to substituting their markets, moving from one market to another. It relates to standards, it relates to connectivity, infrastructures, and a number of things that may help, firms to navigate this very uncertain environment. And of course, it is linked to their ability also to link up with MNEs, which are themselves more able, I would assume, to navigate international waters, even if for MNEs it's also a complicated thing. And on security, I don't think we should strictly narrow this discussion to defense, but security is also, or military perspective, but also security is also, in my understanding, your ability to secure access to strategic inputs, which may be semiconductors, but also basic stuff such as food, water, or anything else that is important for countries, access to trade routes, access to imported technology. So security should be seen in a broader perspective. How do I secure the goods that I need, or do I secure access to the markets that I want to export to? And that means probably better understanding the risks that are attached to your current trade, the trade activity of each firm and each country, and maybe revisit some of them when you're thinking of your trade policies. I don't know if I have time to talk about oligopolies, but I think it's a very important thing to discuss, as Paul mentioned, to discuss the impact of those oligopolistic behaviors on welfare. Of course, in a context where international coordination is weakening, their regulation is made more difficult. Research may be helping here to help estimate financial flows between the various representations of MNEs in different countries, profit, repatriation, transfer pricing, etc. Research may have a role here to play to better understand at least those financial flows within MNEs. On behavioral economics and welfare, also very important to assess the right determinants of welfare, which I think still remain something uncharted because we've seen a lot of backlash against trade. So there's a body of evidence to suggest that what matters is the distribution of losses and gains, and not only the difference between their sums. And this is what matters for political acceptability. And the COVID period, I think, has revealed a lot of preferences that could be considered, or preferences also understood by the government themselves, or no governments assess their citizens' preferences. So that's important. But so we need to think about compensation mechanisms, and it's maybe a country-specific issue, but a very important issue. And it's not only about the compensation mechanism that is politically acceptable for those who are going to lose from trade changes, but also from those who are going to finance those compensation mechanisms. And this is often where the problem here. I like to just highlight one other dimension, which I think is very important. I will not mention services, which is something, of course, a very, very important agenda on which we need to work, both on the data side of flows, better measurement of flows, better understanding of how regulations affect services trade. There's a lot of work ongoing, and it's an invitation to work more on that. But I will want to finish with one point, which is traceability. Also highlighted in the paper by Paul is the fact that trade is increasingly about trading production processes, which have become important in the determination of consumers' preferences. Consumers want to know what is the environmental footprint of the goods they buy, what are the social conditions through which those goods have been produced. And more recently, I mean, governments are more interested because we're moving away from MFN by the real origin, geographical origin of goods. So demonstrating the origin and how the good was produced is becoming a very important source of competitiveness for firms. So you need traceability systems. And given the fixed nature of those compliance costs and your ability to trace your good and demonstrate them, this may also have a welfare implication because it will be easier for big firms and big MNEs to demonstrate and comply and trace the origin of their goods than for smaller ones. In turn, if we work on and I think research can work a lot on thinking of identifying cost-effective traceability mechanism. It's not only a technical issue, there's also governance issue of sharing data, etc. These are important items. And I think that could also then play a role in helping with the statistical detection of global value chains at a very granular level. So I'll finish with that, but just to say that at the World Bank, we are working on all these fronts, on policy fragmentation, on trade risks, on the development impact of trade intervention, on the role that big data can play now to better monitor trade flows, ships, trucks in Africa, services. We are looking increasingly at these issues of traceability because we think they're going to become more and more important, and in relation to the forthcoming World Bank development report on standards. We continue to work on environment and trade. I didn't mention that too much, but that's also a very important dimension, of course, and it's a very important public good. And last, we'll continue developing our data sets and analysis on services trade restriction and services trade flows. And I invite you all who are interested to collaborate with us to do so, because I think these are a very important agenda for development. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, for our audience, I think that was a great conversation because we've got a ton of research ideas, we've got a ton of policy, and that's really what we wanted to achieve. We've got a little bit of time left. So let me try and take a couple of the questions that have come up and turn them over to our speakers for their thoughts. Pol, one that's come up in the Q&A box that I actually really like, you know, if you think of a PhD student out there in our audience and they've just heard all these great research ideas, you know, one thing is having a great idea. The next thing is having the skills to pursue that, you know, right to the end and get a really nice, meaningful answer. So if you were giving advice to a PhD student in a low or middle income country, what skills would you suggest that they focus on to try and answer the sorts of questions that you're bringing up, you know, maybe in the uncharted empirical waters or the uncharted policy waters? What would be the skills that they would want to focus on?
That's a great question. It's not an easy one to answer because many things come to mind, right? Let me give one answer, which is a bit more specific than maybe is desirable, but it maps to some of the things that Sebastien was talking about, which is one area where I think there's a lot of potential for growth, and it maps to the oligopoly, global value chains, etc., is to try to do more case study-like or industry-specific studies that try to understand, maybe in partial equilibrium, there's obviously many things that happen when you think about global trade liberalization and so on and so forth. But let's understand the semiconductors industry. There's a lot of research on the auto industry, but much less on many other sectors. Understanding how global an industry is, how the agents interact, what's the nature of market structure. This is what industrial organization as a field has done. But it is a field that very often is like really trying to push for new techniques. The choice of an industry is more about what can I do with this data? And it's very often industries that are local in nature, domestic in nature. But I do think that gaining an expertise in empirical industrial organization which is it's not an easy field, but it's a field that combines theory, econometrics, okay, and nice data. This is something where I think there's going to be a lot of people working on, and where potentially the impact on policy might be a little bit faster than the 5-10 year thing we were talking about. I'll give you an example. I have a student who's just graduated, Constanza Buin, who had a paper at the interface of international trade, environmental economics, and industrial organization, which was focused on liquefied natural gas. Okay, trying to understand what the Biden policies were doing to that industry, when the environmental impact was going to be in the US and in the rest of the world. And as a PhD student, she was writing the article and at the same time talking to folks in the Biden administration. Why? Because they absolutely wanted to know the answer to this question. So if what you do is focused, rigorous, but focused, and provides answers that are potentially more informative because you're kind of really tailoring the model and the techniques to the application, that is something that I think academics appreciate. And she had a very good market. She's going to Johns Hopkins. But also policymakers would appreciate. Again, I could talk more broadly about econometrics, this and that, or randomized control trials and techniques and all this stuff. But this is just one example where I think it's a sweet spot.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Something I also took away from the main presentation is cross-pollinating with fields like international relations. I think that's really interesting advice. And for people who are coming from more of a kind of policy track, that's something that I mean, I've done that myself. It's something that we've historically done a lot of. So I think that's a very good suggestion. And again, this idea of sort of industry studies, it's interesting how that comes and goes in the literature. When I think of someone that I learned trade from, Richard Baldwin. One of his early things was working on strategic trade policy back in the Krugman days, and they were working on things, as specific as a particular type of memory chip that they were sort of modeling. So I think there is real scope for that. That's a really good suggestion. Hannah, why don't I hand over to you? Is there a question you'd like to get into the mix?
Actually, I was going to throw it to one of our advisors, Barbara Kochwar is here, and she has a really good question. So I was actually going to give it to her because she was asking for like the 5 most important papers or the most like significant things that people should learn apart from these skills that you're talking about. So if there's anything in particular there. And then I would just like to say for people who are looking to do services, that Ben is your guy for services. And for anybody looking to do standards and regulations, that's my favorite topic. So how would you think, Sebastien and Pol, what's the most important things to learn in terms of papers? Where would you start? And that's all the time we have. Sorry.
Okay, so again, I will I would say the following. Encourage people to read the original papers, the Mellets, even important papers that I mentioned, but you need to understand that papers also have a life of their own, even when published, right? So because there's extensions and so on. So when I have somebody comes talk to me that is not necessarily, hasn't taken my course, so a PhD student wants to understand what's happening in trade because they heard it's sort of buzzing or something. I typically refer people to the handbook chapters. Okay. Handbook chapters, the annual reviews of economics. Handbook chapters is something that folks in universities have access to. It's Elsevier, so I don't know if everybody will have free access to it. But every few years, it's commissioned to some top researchers to summarize what's happening in fields. And often it's like with the benefit of a bit of a hindsight, explaining what that paper does, it ends up explaining things much better than the original papers, okay? Because they link it to other things, they kind of zoom in on what's essential. So handbook chapters, annual reviews are typically very good ways to kind of get a sense of what's happening. And then if reading those reviews, there's a paper that stands out as particularly interesting, you go and read that paper. If it's published in the last 5 to 10 years, very often that paper will have replication materials. So if you're entrepreneurial and when you get under the hood and understand how that was done, and you have some expertise on coding or things like that, there's actually the scope of by replication gaining a bit more of an insight, because then it's, you can use it in other stuff. So that's what I often tell my students, and I think it is important. Get your hands dirty too, right? So it's just not reading, but actually trying to understand how they did it, trying to replicate things. That is a very good way to learn. Then can put you at the frontier to be able to kind of push the frontier.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I can just say, a comment in the box about paywalls. One thing that I would say, if you don't have university access to things like the handbooks and journal sites and all those sorts of things, top researchers nearly always have a website where they have an ungated version of the paper next to the replication file, next to technical appendices and all those sorts of things. So it is worthwhile digging around a little bit for that. You can often find a next to final version of the text that is not behind a paywall. So, but that's really excellent advice. And I'm conscious that we've just ticked over to 10 o'clock. So we covered an enormous amount of territory in that talk, which I think was just what we wanted to do. Pol, thank you very much again for so generously sharing both your time and also all of these ideas that you've put out there. I know that's real gold for our audience, so we really do appreciate you sharing that. Sebastien, thank you so much for bringing this to a policy level as well, and telling us a little bit about how this looks from the World Bank and what's going on at the World Bank. I think that's also really gold for our audience, so we really appreciate that. And, thank you everyone for participating and for your great questions and comments as we've gone through. Let me just advertise our next webinar. We'll be back in July 17th. We have Filippo Santi talking about government procurement. So that's one of those trade and issues that hasn't got the attention that it deserves. And it's a really nice piece of empirical work on the effective procurement on local demand markets. So we'll put out details of that on the mailing list. It'll be your post-webinar screen when it comes up, so please do sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it. Please do join the LinkedIn group. We're happy to talk more about the subjects on there and stay in touch. And again, thank you to our presenters. Thanks, Hannah, as always. And thanks to all of our audience. We'll see you next month.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. Good luck to
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.